The hospital was buzzing with the kind of tension that only a major emergency could provoke. Nurses and doctors moved swiftly through the hallways, their faces set with purpose as they prepared for what could be a long night ahead. In the middle of the chaos, Lisa Carter stood near the operating room, her fingers absently drumming against the side of a metal tray. Her eyes flicked towards the clock, knowing that Dr. Richard Campbell, the head surgeon, would be arriving any moment. She inhaled deeply, bracing herself. Lisa had worked with Dr. Campbell for years, long enough to understand that tonight would likely be no different than the others. Campbell was known for his skill, but equally infamous for his temper, especially when things didn't go exactly as he wanted. And lately, it seemed she had been the target of his frustrations more than anyone else. Lisa's colleagues often told her to ignore him, but the truth was, it was hard to ignore a man who belittled you in front of everyone on a regular basis. The doors to the operating room swung open abruptly, and there he was, Dr. Campbell, tall and imposing, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room as though he were already disappointed by what he saw. Without a word, he walked briskly towards the surgical table, his white coat billowing behind him. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His voice was cold, detached. Lisa adjusted her gloves and moved to her station, keeping her focus on the patient. The man lying on the table was unconscious but recognizable. Howard Thompson, the hospital's board president. This surgery had to be perfect. Dr. Campbell looked over at Lisa, his gaze narrowing. "Carter, I expect you to keep up tonight. No room for mistakes." "I'm always ready," Lisa responded calmly, though inside, she could feel the familiar churn of anxiety beginning to form. He scoffed, leaning in towards her. "We'll see." The first few minutes of the surgery passed in relative silence, aside from the steady beeps of the heart monitor and the faint hum of the overhead lights. But as the procedure became more delicate, Dr. Campbell's patience wore thin. He muttered instructions under his breath, clearly agitated with how slowly things seemed to be moving. "Lisa, the forceps," he demanded, holding out his hand. She handed them to him quickly, but not quickly enough for Campbell's liking. "Do you need me to teach you how to hand over an instrument, Carter? God, you're slower than a first-year med student," he snapped, his voice loud enough for the other nurses to hear. Lisa's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. There was no point in escalating things now, especially not with the surgery still in progress. A few minutes later, the tension in the room thickened. Dr. Campbell was moving quickly, too quickly, and his impatience started to show in his technique. The surgical assistants exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared to say anything. Everyone knew better than to interrupt Campbell when he was in one of his moods. "Lisa," Campbell growled, his eyes flicking up towards her. "What's taking so long with the sutures?" "I'm prepping them," she answered, keeping her tone even. He rolled his eyes, shaking his head in disbelief. "This is basic stuff. Honestly, sometimes I wonder how you even got this job." That stung, more than it should have. Lisa swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay focused. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, but she couldn't let him see how much his words affected her. The operation continued, but the tension between Lisa and Dr. Campbell only grew. Every few minutes, he would snap at her, finding something, anything, to criticize. Her hands were too slow, her movements too clumsy, her focus not sharp enough. It was as though he had made it his mission to undermine her in every possible way. Near the end of the procedure, as they worked to close the patient's chest, Campbell's voice rang out again, cutting through the stillness like a whip. "Careful, Carter. I'd hate to have to redo your mistakes." Lisa looked up from her work, meeting his gaze for the first time that night. "I'm being careful. Everything's under control." His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it seemed like he might explode. But instead, he just shook his head in disgust, turning his attention back to the patient. "We'll see about that." As the surgery came to a close, Lisa could feel the weight of the evening pressing down on her. She had done everything right. She knew that. But no matter how hard she worked, how perfect she tried to be, it was never enough for Dr. Campbell. The room began to clear, the other nurses and surgical staff quietly packing up their instruments, trying to avoid eye contact with both Lisa and Campbell. Lisa stayed back, finishing up the last of her duties, while Campbell scrubbed out, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. Suddenly, the door to the operating room swung open again, and a hospital administrator walked in, her expression tense. "Dr. Campbell," she said quickly, "we need you in the boardroom. Now." Campbell frowned, pulling off his gloves. "Can it wait? We just finished surgery." The administrator shook her head. "No, it can't. Mr. Thompson is awake. He wants to see you." Lisa froze, her hand hovering over the tray of instruments. Thompson was awake? But they had given him enough anesthesia to keep him out for hours. How could he possibly be awake so soon? Campbell didn't seem fazed, though. He simply nodded and headed for the door without another glance at Lisa. But as he left, something in the pit of Lisa's stomach twisted. There was something off about all of this, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Alone now, Lisa finished cleaning up the room. The silence was almost suffocating, a stark contrast to the earlier chaos. She glanced up at the clock, midnight. Another long, exhausting shift. Another night of biting her tongue and swallowing her pride. As she removed her gloves and washed her hands, Lisa caught her reflection in the stainless steel sink. For a moment, she barely recognized herself. The lines of exhaustion under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, it was all starting to take its toll. She had been in this job for years, and yet it felt like she was still fighting the same battles over and over again. The door behind her creaked open, and one of the younger nurses, Sarah, poked her head in. "Hey, Lisa," she said softly, stepping into the room. "You okay?" Lisa forced a small smile, wiping her hands on a towel. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just another rough night." Sarah frowned, her eyes full of concern. "Campbell's being an ass again, isn't he?" Lisa shrugged, trying to brush it off. "Same old story. Nothing new." But Sarah didn't let it go. "It's not right, you know. The way he talks to you. Nobody should have to put up with that." Lisa sighed, leaning back against the counter. "I know, but what can I do? He's the head surgeon. If I say anything, it'll just make things worse." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer. "I heard Thompson's awake. Do you think he, heard anything?" Lisa shook her head slowly. "I don't know. I hope not. But even if he did, what difference would it make?" "You never know," Sarah said quietly, glancing towards the door. "Sometimes, people surprise you." Lisa wasn't so sure about that. In her experience, people like Dr. Campbell rarely faced consequences for their actions. And people like her? Well, they were just expected to endure it. But something about tonight felt different. Something was coming. Lisa sat alone in the staff lounge, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. She was still shaken from the surgery, replaying every word that had been thrown at her, every insult from Dr. Campbell. Despite years of practice at keeping her emotions in check, tonight had been different. The way he had spoken to her in front of the others had cut deeper than usual. But now, as she sat there, she felt something else creeping in, uncertainty. The door swung open, and Sarah entered, her expression softening as soon as she saw Lisa. "You're still here?" Sarah asked, pulling a chair up next to her. "I thought you'd have left by now." "I just needed a minute," Lisa replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She stared down at her hands, the lines of fatigue visible even in the low light. Sarah hesitated before speaking again. "I heard about the surgery. Campbell, he really went too far this time, didn't he?" Lisa gave a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Too far? He always goes too far. It's just," she paused, searching for the right words. "It's like no matter how hard I work, how much I prove myself, he finds a way to tear me down." Sarah looked at her sympathetically, placing a hand on Lisa's arm. "He's not worth it. You're one of the best nurses here. Everyone knows that. Campbell? He's just stuck in his ways." Lisa sighed, leaning back in her chair. "It's not that simple, Sarah. You know how things work here. Men like him, they always get away with it." Before Sarah could respond, the door to the lounge opened again. This time, it was Dr. Susan Miller, the hospital's chief of administration. She stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Lisa, I need to speak with you for a moment," Dr. Miller said, her tone formal but not unkind. Lisa's heart sank.
Now.
Dr. Miller nodded, gesturing for Lisa to follow her. Sarah gave Lisa's hand a reassuring squeeze as she stood up. As they walked through the empty corridors of the hospital, Lisa felt the weight of the day settling in her chest. She had no idea what this meeting was about, but she suspected it had something to do with the surgery earlier. Had Campbell complained about her? Was she about to be reprimanded for something he caused? When they reached Dr. Miller's office, Lisa entered and sat down, feeling the tension build. Dr. Miller took a seat across from her, folding her hands neatly on the desk. "I know it's been a long night," Dr. Miller began, her green eyes focused on Lisa. "But there's something we need to address." Lisa nodded slowly, bracing herself for the worst. "Mr. Thompson, Howard Thompson, has requested a meeting," Dr. Miller continued, her voice measured. "He woke up earlier than expected from the anesthesia. Apparently, he was conscious for part of the surgery." Lisa felt a jolt of shock run through her. He was awake? Dr. Miller's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes. He overheard some of the exchanges that took place in the operating room. He's asked to speak with you and Dr. Campbell personally." Lisa's stomach twisted. "He heard what Dr. Campbell said?" "It seems so," Dr. Miller replied. "And now, he wants answers." Lisa sat in silence as Dr. Miller's words sank in. Howard Thompson, the president of the hospital board, had been conscious during the surgery, and he had heard everything. She thought back to the biting comments Campbell had made, the way he had humiliated her in front of the entire team. If Mr. Thompson had heard all of that, what happens now? Lisa asked quietly, her voice barely steady. Dr. Miller studied her for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. "We're meeting with Mr. Thompson in an hour. I suggest you prepare yourself. He's not happy, and I have a feeling this is going to be a difficult conversation." Lisa nodded, her mind racing. What could she possibly say? She hadn't done anything wrong. She knew that. But the thought of confronting both Dr. Campbell and the hospital's most powerful figure was terrifying. By the time Lisa arrived in the meeting room, the air was thick with tension. Dr. Campbell was already seated at the long wooden table, looking as arrogant as ever. His expression barely shifted when Lisa entered the room, though she could feel his cold gaze following her every move. She sat down at the opposite end of the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Dr. Miller stood by the door, waiting. A few moments later, Howard Thompson entered the room. He moved slowly, a stern expression on his face, his posture still commanding despite the ordeal he had just been through. He took a seat at the head of the table, his eyes moving between Lisa and Dr. Campbell. The silence that followed was suffocating. "I'm not one to waste time," Mr. Thompson began, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "I'll get straight to the point. During the surgery, I was conscious. I heard everything." Lisa's heart pounded in her chest, her throat suddenly dry. She glanced at Dr. Campbell, who still had that same look of indifference on his face, though his eyes flickered with something like unease. "Dr. Campbell," Mr. Thompson continued, his tone sharp, "the way you spoke to Ms. Carter was unacceptable." Campbell shifted in his seat, finally breaking his silence. "Mr. Thompson, I assure you, my comments were in the heat of the moment. Surgery is a high-pressure environment. We were working on saving your life." "Enough," Mr. Thompson interrupted, his voice firm. "I'm aware of the stress involved in these situations. But what I heard was not a matter of pressure. It was personal, demeaning." Lisa could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. She hadn't expected this. To have someone like Mr. Thompson call out Dr. Campbell's behavior so directly was both vindicating and overwhelming. Campbell's jaw clenched. "I assure you, Mr. Thompson, that I have the utmost respect for my colleagues." "Respect?" Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow, leaning forward. "What I heard was not respect. It was condescension, bordering on harassment. And I won't tolerate it in my hospital." The room fell silent again, the weight of Mr. Thompson's words hanging heavily in the air. Lisa's pulse raced. She had never seen anyone talk to Dr. Campbell this way, let alone someone as powerful as Mr. Thompson. For the first time that night, Campbell looked genuinely unsettled. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Lisa swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak up. "Mr. Thompson, I appreciate you addressing this, but what happens next?" Mr. Thompson turned his gaze to her, his expression softening slightly. "Next, we have a decision to make. I can't allow this kind of behavior to continue, not from anyone, especially not from someone in Dr. Campbell's position." Dr. Campbell sat up straighter, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Are you suggesting disciplinary action, Mr. Thompson, based on what you think you overheard?" "What I know I heard," Mr. Thompson corrected, his tone calm but resolute. "And yes, there will be consequences. Dr. Campbell, I'm placing you under review. The board will be informed, and we will decide on the appropriate actions. This hospital will not tolerate abusive behavior, no matter who it's coming from." The color drained from Dr. Campbell's face. Lisa watched, stunned, as the man who had spent years terrorizing his colleagues suddenly found himself at the mercy of someone more powerful than him. After the meeting, Lisa stepped outside, the cool night air hitting her face like a wave of relief. She stood in the parking lot, looking up at the dark sky, her thoughts swirling. It wasn't over yet. There would still be fallout from all of this. But for the first time in a long time, Lisa felt like things might actually change. The sound of footsteps behind her made her turn. Sarah was walking towards her, a concerned look on her face. "How'd it go?" Sarah asked, stopping next to her. Lisa exhaled, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Better than I expected." Sarah grinned, nudging her gently. "You see, maybe this is the start of something good." "Maybe," Lisa agreed, though there was still a part of her that couldn't fully believe it. After years of being belittled and dismissed, it was hard to trust that real change was possible. But as she stood there, the weight of the night finally lifting off her shoulders, Lisa allowed herself a glimmer of hope. Dr. Richard Campbell sat in his office, staring at the medical journals neatly stacked on his mahogany desk. The silence of the room was unnerving, punctuated only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. He ran a hand through his graying hair, his thoughts racing. The meeting with Howard Thompson had rattled him. He was not used to being questioned, especially not by the hospital board president. In his mind, everything he had done in the operating room was justified. Surgery was a high-pressure environment, and sometimes people needed to be pushed to their limits. That's how you got the best out of them, or so he believed. But now, Thompson was forcing him to confront something he had never considered before. His words had consequences. His phone buzzed on the desk, cutting through the stillness. It was Susan Miller, the chief of administration. He hesitated before picking it up. "Dr. Campbell." Susan's voice was calm but firm, as always. "The board is meeting tomorrow to discuss the review process. I thought you should know." Richard leaned back in his chair, the tension building in his chest. "The board? I assumed Mr. Thompson was just upset. I didn't realize this was going to escalate." "I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation," Susan said sharply. "Howard Thompson isn't just upset. He's furious. He overheard everything, and he's determined to take action. You need to prepare yourself for the worst." "The worst?" Richard repeated, a flash of indignation creeping into his voice. "You can't be serious, Susan. We're talking about a few harsh words during a surgery. I've seen far worse behavior go unpunished in this hospital." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Susan sighed. "Richard, this isn't just about you. The culture of this hospital is at stake. Thompson wants to make an example of you to prove that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated anymore." Campbell clenched his jaw, his hand tightening around the phone. "An example? I've been here for over 20 years, Susan. My track record speaks for itself." "I know that," she replied, her tone softening slightly. "But times are changing. People like Lisa Carter, they're not going to stay silent anymore. The way you spoke to her, it crossed a line, and you need to accept that." The mention of Lisa's name made Richard's stomach turn. He had dismissed her so easily, assumed she would brush off his comments like everyone else. But now, it seemed like she was at the center of all this. "I'll think about it," he muttered, before hanging up the phone abruptly. Later that evening, Lisa was in the locker room, changing out of her scrubs. The day had been emotionally draining, and all she wanted was to go home and forget about it. But as she stuffed her uniform into her bag, the door creaked open. It was Dr. Campbell. Lisa stiffened, her fingers freezing on the zipper of her bag. She hadn't expected to see him here, not after everything that had happened. "Carter," he began, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "I need to talk to you." Lisa turned slowly, her eyes narrowing. "What do you want, Dr. Campbell?" For a moment, Richard hesitated. He had never apologized to anyone before, certainly not to someone like Lisa. But as he stood there, he realized that this was his only chance to salvage whatever was left of his career. "I wanted to say that I may have been out of line during the surgery," he said, his tone stiff and formal. Lisa blinked, her surprise evident. "Out of line? You humiliated me, Dr. Campbell, in front of the entire surgical team." Richard shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking to the floor. "Look, I'm not saying I was completely wrong. The operating room is stressful, and sometimes things are said in the heat of the moment." "That's your excuse?" Lisa's voice was calm, but there was an edge of anger beneath the surface. "That it was the heat of the moment? You've been doing this for years, Dr. Campbell. You talk down to people, especially women, and especially women of color, like we don't deserve to be here." Her words hit him harder than he expected. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He had never thought of himself as a racist or a misogynist. He was just tough, demanding. But as Lisa stood there, staring him down with an intensity that made him feel small, he realized that maybe he had been blind to his own flaws. "I'm not here for your apology," Lisa said, shaking her head. "And I don't need you to justify what you did. What I want is for you to think about how you treat people. Because if this hospital really is going to change, it starts with you." Richard swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. He had never felt so powerless before, standing in front of a nurse who, in that moment, held more authority than he did. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the locker room, leaving Lisa alone with her thoughts. The next morning, the hospital board gathered in the conference room. The air was thick with tension as the members filed in, taking their seats around the long table. Howard Thompson sat at the head, his eyes sharp and focused. Dr. Campbell entered the room last, his face a mask of calm, though inside, he was anything but. "Let's get started," Thompson said, his voice commanding the room's attention. "We're here today to discuss the incident involving Dr. Richard Campbell during the recent surgery. As you all know, I was the patient on the table and I heard everything." The board members exchanged glances, the gravity of the situation settling over them. Dr. Campbell cleared his throat, ready to defend himself. "Mr. Thompson, I'd like to clarify." "No, Dr. Campbell," Thompson interrupted, his tone icy. "You don't need to clarify anything. I heard what you said to Nurse Carter, and I'm not interested in excuses. What I want to know is whether or not you understand the impact of your words." Richard's hands tightened into fists under the table, his frustration barely contained. "I've been a surgeon at this hospital for over 2 decades. My record speaks for itself. I push my team because that's what it takes to save lives. If that makes me harsh, so be it." Thompson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't about your skill as a surgeon, Dr. Campbell. It's about how you treat the people you work with. The way you spoke to Lisa Carter was not just harsh. It was disrespectful, and it crossed a line. I won't have that kind of behavior in this hospital." One of the board members, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Collins, cleared her throat. "Dr. Campbell, no one is questioning your abilities as a surgeon, but we are questioning your conduct. This hospital has a reputation to uphold, and we cannot allow any form of harassment or discrimination to go unchecked." Richard's pulse quickened, the walls closing in around him. He had never felt so cornered, so exposed. "I was doing my job," he said, his voice wavering, "pushing people to be their best. That's all." Thompson exchanged a glance with Dr. Collins before turning back to Campbell. "We've decided to place you on probation, Dr. Campbell. You'll undergo mandatory sensitivity training, and we'll be monitoring your conduct closely. Any further incidents, and you'll be suspended, pending further review." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. Probation. Sensitivity training. It was a humiliation unlike anything he had ever experienced. He had always been the one in control, the one calling the shots. But now, it seemed that control had slipped through his fingers. "I understand," Richard said quietly, his voice barely audible. Thompson gave a curt nod. "This meeting is adjourned." As the board members filed out of the room, Richard remained in his seat, staring blankly at the table in front of him. His mind was racing, but all he could feel was a dull sense of defeat. He had built his career on being the best, on pushing people to their limits and never backing down. But now, for the first time, he was being forced to confront the possibility that he had been wrong. Lisa Carter walked past the open door of the conference room, her eyes catching his for a brief moment. She didn't say anything, but the look on her face said it all. She wasn't gloating or seeking revenge. She was simply relieved. And in that moment, Richard realized that this wasn't just about his career anymore. It was about something much bigger, something he had been too blind to see for far too long. Without a word, he stood up and walked out of the room, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. Lisa Carter walked down the hospital corridor, her footsteps echoing against the sterile white walls. The news of Dr. Campbell's probation had spread quickly, and the atmosphere in the hospital was thick with tension. Nurses whispered in corners, doctors exchanged loaded glances, and the entire place felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Lisa, however, felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. The events of the past few days had been overwhelming. For years, she had endured Dr. Campbell's arrogance, his biting comments, his dismissal of her competence. And now, for the first time, someone in a position of power had taken her side. Yet, the weight of everything still clung to her, as if the storm hadn't quite passed. As she rounded the corner, she saw Dr. Susan Miller coming towards her, clipboard in hand. Susan stopped when she spotted Lisa, her eyes softening. "Lisa," she greeted, "how are you holding up?" "I'm managing," Lisa replied, not quite sure how else to describe the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Susan nodded, her expression thoughtful. "What happened with Dr. Campbell? It needed to happen. And not just for you, but for everyone who's ever had to deal with his behavior." "I know," Lisa said quietly, "but it still feels unfinished." "That's because it is," Susan replied. "He's under review, but nothing's been finalized. And the truth is, Lisa, you're a key part of that decision. The board is looking to you for guidance on how to move forward." Lisa blinked, surprised. "Me?" "Yes," Susan confirmed. "You were the one who stood up to him. And now, they want to know what you think should happen next." Lisa stared at Susan, a mixture of shock and apprehension washing over her. She hadn't expected this. Sure, she had wanted Campbell to face consequences for what he had done, but the idea that she could shape what happened next, that was a responsibility she wasn't sure she was ready for. "I don't know," Lisa admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I want to happen." Susan placed a hand on Lisa's arm, giving her a reassuring squeeze. "Take your time. But remember, this is your chance to make sure this hospital changes for the better." Dr. Campbell stood in his office, pacing back and forth, the sound of his shoes tapping against the floor. His mind was racing, replaying every conversation he'd had with the board, every word that had been thrown at him. The idea of being on probation, of having his authority questioned, was a blow he hadn't anticipated. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He turned to see Dr. Jonathan Harris, one of his colleagues and a longtime friend, standing in the doorway. "Mind if I come in?" Harris asked. Campbell nodded, motioning for him to enter. Jonathan closed the door behind him, a concerned look on his face. "So, this is really happening, huh?" Jonathan said, sinking into one of the leather chairs across from Campbell's desk. "Apparently," Campbell muttered, sitting down at his desk, rubbing his temples. "Thompson is making a bigger deal out of this than it needs to be." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "You don't think humiliating a nurse in front of an entire surgical team is a big deal?" Campbell shot him a look. "It was a high-pressure situation. Things get said." "Yeah, things get said," Jonathan replied, leaning forward. "But Richard, you didn't just lose your temper once. This is a pattern. People have been talking about your behavior for years. Campbell bristled, his voice defensive. You think I'm the only surgeon who pushes his team? This is surgery, Jonathan, not some feel-good therapy session. We're dealing with life and death here. That's not the point, Jonathan said sharply. The point is, you can't treat people like they're beneath you. Especially not someone like Lisa. She's one of the best nurses we've got. Campbell scoffed, crossing his arms. So, now you're on her side too? I'm not on anyone's side, Jonathan replied. But I am telling you that you need to look at this from another angle. This is your chance to make things right. If you keep digging in your heels, the board's going to come down hard on you. Campbell clenched his jaw, the weight of Jonathan's words sinking in. He had spent his entire career building a reputation as the best, and now it felt like that reputation was slipping through his fingers. Maybe you're right, Campbell muttered, his voice low. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, watching his friend carefully. I think you need to talk to Lisa, not just to clear your name, but to actually listen to her. Campbell didn't respond, his mind swirling with thoughts he wasn't ready to confront. Later that afternoon, Lisa found herself standing outside Dr. Campbell's office. She had been summoned, though no explanation had been given. She hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and knocked. Come in, Campbell's voice called from inside. Lisa stepped into the office, her heart pounding in her chest. Campbell was sitting at his desk, looking more subdued than she had ever seen him. The usual arrogance in his posture was gone, replaced by something almost uncertain. Lisa, he began, gesturing to the chair across from him. Please sit. She did, her eyes never leaving his. There was an awkward silence, heavy and uncomfortable, before Campbell finally spoke again. I wanted to talk to you about what happened, he said, his voice quieter than usual. Lisa crossed her arms, leaning back slightly in the chair. I'm listening. Campbell's gaze flicked to the window for a moment, as if searching for the right words. I know I've been difficult to work with. Difficult? Lisa repeated, raising an eyebrow. That's putting it mildly. Campbell exhaled, his shoulders sagging. I've always believed that pushing people hard was the way to get the best results. I've been a surgeon for over 20 years, and in that time, I've saved a lot of lives. But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing the people around me as people. Lisa stared at him, unsure of where this was going. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Campbell continued, his voice steady. But I do want you to know that I realize I was wrong. The way I treated you, it was unacceptable. And I'm sorry. Lisa blinked, surprised by his words. She had expected a confrontation, maybe even more arrogance. But this was something different. I appreciate the apology, Lisa said slowly, but it's going to take more than words to fix this. Campbell nodded, his expression grim. I know. That's why I want your help. Lisa's eyes widened. My help? I'm on probation, Campbell explained. The board is watching everything I do, and they've made it clear that I need to change. But I don't know where to start. You've worked with me for years, Lisa. You know what needs to change better than anyone. Lisa sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. She had spent so long resenting Campbell, hating the way he treated her and others. And now, here he was, asking for her guidance. I don't know if I'm the right person to help you, she said carefully. This isn't my problem to fix. I know, Campbell replied quickly, but you're the one I need to listen to. I can't do this alone. Lisa hesitated, her thoughts swirling. Part of her wanted to walk out, to let Campbell face the consequences of his actions on his own. But another part of her, the part that believed in change and progress, felt compelled to stay. After a long pause, she finally spoke. If I help you, there are going to be conditions. Campbell nodded, his eyes locked on hers. Name them. First, Lisa said, her voice firm. You need to actually listen to what I'm saying. No more excuses, no more justifications. If I'm going to help you change, you need to be open to it. Agreed, Campbell said quickly. Second, Lisa continued. You need to make this about more than just you. The culture in this hospital needs to change, and that starts with the people at the top. If you're serious about this, you'll use your position to push for real reform. Campbell's expression softened, a hint of respect in his eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes." Lisa studied him for a moment, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. But for the first time since she had known him, she saw something real, something genuine. "All right," she said finally. "I'll help you." Campbell let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Thank you." The days that followed were strange for Lisa. Working with Dr. Campbell was awkward, to say the least. He was still learning, still adjusting to the idea of treating people with respect, but for the first time, Lisa could see that he was trying. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when his old habits crept in, but it was progress. The rest of the hospital, however, was not as forgiving. Word had spread about Campbell's probation, and many of the nurses and doctors were still skeptical of his ability to change. Whispers filled the halls, and Lisa found herself caught in the middle of it all. Some people praised her for standing up to Campbell, while others questioned her decision to help him. But through it all, Lisa kept her focus on the bigger picture. This wasn't just about Dr. Campbell. This was about changing the culture of the hospital, about making sure that what happened to her wouldn't happen to anyone else. And for the first time, Lisa felt like she had the power to make that change happen. Lisa Carter stood in front of the hospital's large windows, watching the city bustle below. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue across the buildings, and the air outside was crisp with the early signs of autumn. Inside the hospital, though, the tension was palpable. The final board meeting about Dr. Campbell was scheduled to start in less than an hour, and Lisa could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. She had agreed to help Dr. Campbell reform, but the last few weeks had been far from easy. Some days, it felt like he was genuinely trying to change, while other days, his old arrogance seeped through the cracks. And now, it was all coming to a head. The board would decide his fate, and Lisa's voice would play a crucial role in that decision. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She turned to see Howard Thompson standing in the doorway, his expression kind but serious. "May I come in?" he asked. "Of course, Mr. Thompson," Lisa replied, gesturing for him to enter. Howard stepped into the room, his hands clasped behind his back as he approached the window. He stood beside her, looking out at the city for a moment before speaking. "How are you feeling about today?" he asked, his voice gentle. Lisa took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. "I'm not sure. It's been a lot to process." "I imagine it has," Howard said, nodding. "You've shown a great deal of strength through all of this, Lisa. I want you to know that." "Thank you," Lisa said quietly, "but it doesn't feel like it's over yet." Howard turned to face her, his eyes thoughtful. "It won't be over until the culture in this hospital changes for good. And that starts with the decisions we make today." Lisa nodded, her mind swirling with the gravity of it all. "I just want to make sure that whatever happens, it's the right decision." Howard studied her for a moment, then placed a hand on her shoulder. "I trust your judgment, Lisa. You've earned that trust." The boardroom was silent as the members filed in, each one taking their seat around the long wooden table. Dr. Campbell sat at one end, his face pale and his fingers nervously tapping on the armrest of his chair. Lisa sat across from him, her heart racing, though she kept her expression calm. Howard Thompson took his place at the head of the table, his presence commanding but steady. He glanced around the room, making sure everyone was settled before speaking. "Today, we are here to discuss the review of Dr. Richard Campbell's behavior and conduct over the past several months," Howard began, his voice firm. "As you all know, this situation has brought to light many issues within our hospital's culture, and this meeting will determine the steps we take moving forward." Dr. Susan Miller leaned forward slightly, her eyes focused on Campbell. "Dr. Campbell, you've been under review for the way you treated Nurse Carter during the surgery, as well as for your behavior in the weeks that followed. We've received reports of both improvement and instances where old habits have resurfaced. Do you have anything you'd like to say before we proceed?" Campbell cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "I've made mistakes," he began, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "I know that I've pushed people too hard, and I've said things I shouldn't have, but I've also tried to change. I've taken Lisa's guidance seriously, and I've worked to be more aware of how I treat my colleagues." Lisa watched him carefully, trying to gauge how much of his speech was genuine. She had seen glimpses of sincerity in him over the past few weeks, but there were still moments where his arrogance crept back in. "I'm not perfect," Campbell continued, his eyes briefly flicking to Lisa, "but I believe I can continue to improve with the right support." Howard nodded, listening intently. "Lisa," he said, turning his attention to her, "you've been working closely with Dr. Campbell during this probationary period. What are your thoughts?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Lisa. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before speaking. "Dr. Campbell has made some progress," Lisa began, choosing her words carefully. "There have been moments where he's shown real growth, where he's listened and tried to change the way he interacts with others. But there have also been moments where his old behavior came through. It's clear that this isn't a quick fix. Real change is going to take time, and it's going to require more than just surface-level adjustments." Howard nodded thoughtfully, his gaze steady on Lisa. "Do you believe he's capable of making that change?" Lisa hesitated, glancing at Campbell before answering. "I think he's capable, yes, but only if he fully commits to it. And that means being open to criticism, being willing to step back and let others take the lead when necessary." Dr. Campbell's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. He knew this was a crucial moment, and any outburst or sign of defiance could seal his fate. Howard leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. "Thank you, Lisa. Your insight is invaluable." There was a long pause as the board members exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. Finally, Dr. Susan Miller spoke again. "We have to make a decision that reflects the values we want this hospital to uphold," she said. "Dr. Campbell's skill as a surgeon is undeniable, but we cannot ignore the impact his behavior has had on the people around him. This isn't just about one incident. It's about creating an environment where everyone is treated with respect and dignity." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Howard Thompson cleared his throat, his voice measured. "I believe the best course of action is to extend Dr. Campbell's probation with stricter conditions. He will continue to work closely with Lisa and undergo additional training focused on leadership and communication. If we see any more incidents of unprofessional behavior, we will have no choice but to take further disciplinary action." Dr. Campbell exhaled, a mixture of relief and tension visible in his posture. He had been spared, for now. "Are we all in agreement?" Howard asked, looking around the table. The board members nodded one by one, and with that, the decision was made. After the meeting, Lisa found herself standing in the hallway, trying to process everything that had just happened. She had expected the outcome, but the weight of it all still lingered in her chest. As she stood there, lost in thought, Dr. Campbell approached her. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility that Lisa wasn't used to seeing. "Lisa," he began, his voice soft, I want to thank you for everything. I know I've made things difficult, and I know I have a lot more to learn, but I appreciate your help." Lisa studied him for a moment, searching for any sign of insincerity. But for the first time, she saw something real, something genuine. "I didn't do it for you," Lisa said, her tone calm but firm. "I did it for this hospital, for the people who work here, and for the people who come through those doors needing our help. If you really want to make things right, you need to remember that." Campbell nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I understand, and I'll do my best to live up to that." Lisa gave him a small nod, then turned to walk away. But before she could leave, Campbell called after her. "Lisa," he said, his voice soft but clear. "I know I've said it before, but I really am sorry." She paused for a moment, then looked over her shoulder at him. "I know, but sorry isn't enough. Actions are what matter now." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Dr. Campbell standing alone in the hallway. As the days passed, Lisa noticed subtle changes in the hospital's atmosphere. The whispers in the hallways grew quieter, the tension that had once filled the air slowly dissipating. Dr. Campbell kept his head down, working hard to prove that he was serious about reforming. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments where his temper flared, where old habits threatened to resurface, but for the first time, it felt like progress was being made. One afternoon, as Lisa was walking through the hospital, she passed by a group of young nurses in the break room. They were laughing, their expressions light and relaxed, a stark contrast to the anxiety that had once dominated the space. It was a small moment, but it filled Lisa with a quiet sense of pride. She had fought for this. She had stood up, even when it felt impossible, and now, she was seeing the results of that fight. It wasn't just about Dr. Campbell. It was about creating a culture of respect, of fairness, of equality. As she continued down the hallway, Lisa's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Howard Thompson. "Thank you for everything, Lisa. You've made a real difference." Lisa smiled, slipping her phone back into her pocket. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. Her journey wasn't over. There was still work to be done, and she knew there would be more challenges ahead. But for now, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, to reflect on how far she had come. And as she walked through the hospital, she knew that no matter what came next, she was ready.